Hi, in this tutorial I'm gonna show you how to create a Reese based sound on the Prophet Rev2. I've used this sound last January in some jams and people were asking me how I designed the sound. So I'm just gonna go over it from the initial patch to the final sound. And first let's listen to some examples of how I used it in previous jams. So now I'm gonna play the sound we're gonna be creating in isolation, and this is the sound that I've used in the first clip that I've played. Yeah, let's go. So first of all, I have some notes. This is the 16 voice model of the Prophet Rev2. For the specific patch we're creating, we're using 8 voices. So if you do have the 8 voice model, it will be able to sound the same. The reverb you're hearing is not part of the patch. The Rev2 only has one effect per layer, and we're only going to be using one layer. Specifically, the effect we're using is distortion, and the reverb you heard is coming from the Specular reverb, an external effects pedal I'm using. I do think reverb is an essential part of this patch, so you'll need to add that to your own patch with some either your DAW or some effects pedal. Next, the tuning that I'm using for this patch is actually up a fifth. So if you see me playing an F, it will actually sound as a C. And this is specifically for the patch that I used in the jam, but it doesn't have any impact on how the overall sound will be. It's just something to keep in mind. And finally, during the performance of this specific sequence, I enabled hold to sustain the notes that I was playing. That's just to, I'll let you hear the difference. So when I have hold enabled, it will be like this. And when I have hold disabled, it will be like this. Just so that that's clear why I'm using it. So before we start twisting any knobs, I just want to quickly analyze the sound a little bit. This is something that I do when I hear something that I want to recreate. I just listen to the specific elements of a sound so that I know what I'm going to work towards. So one of the things that is essential to this sound is the distortion. It adds a lot of character to this specific sound, and next is the movement, both in pitch but also in the harmonics of the specific sound. So let's listen a little bit more carefully. I'm going to turn off the reverb right now. So I hope you can hear the different ways the sound is evolving even if I'm just holding one note. Another essential part of this is a unison patch, meaning that all oscillators will play one note at a time. And when you have unison enabled, you can also enable glide. And that's what this does. And if you turn glide off, that's also an important part. And finally, there are some accents that I'm using Aftertouch. So if I press this note, and the keystep supports aftertouch, so when I press it harder, you'll hear that accent. So let's get started with building this sound. I've come up with 3 chapters. The first part will cover the basic sound, so that's mostly the oscillators and the unison part. The next part is modulation and effects to add movement to the sound. And the third part is about expressiveness, so how to make the sound more interesting when you're playing it. Alright, so we're gonna get started with an initial patch, and on the Rev2 you do this by first selecting some slot that you want to store this new patch in. You go to global settings and scroll over to item 29 and press right. It says basic program, press right and you have an initial patch. Cool, so first let's look at the unison part and some other patch settings. We're gonna go to parameters and go over to, actually let's look at the first item, which is program value. When you're using unison mode and you're layering multiple oscillators to play the same note, the overall volume of your patch will get a lot louder. By default it's set to 127, we're gonna set it to 80. By the way, if it sounds like I'm reading specific values, that's because I have a list of notes for myself. Anyway, that's set to 80. Let's scroll to unison mode, and this is set to 1 voice now, but we'll up it to 8 voices. And then there's a unison detune. In this patch, I'm not going to use the tuning like this. We'll use an LFO and other ways to detune the sound a little. So we'll skip that. And the final thing I want to talk about in terms of unison is the key mode. This determines which notes you can play when you play the keyboard, and it's actually easiest if I just show you. So first we'll enable unison, go back to parameters, and the default mode for key mode is low. So when I press a note now and press one after, I can only play the lower note and not the higher note. I'll show you. I think that's quite weird, to be honest, but so the opposite is high, and I think last is the most natural to me. Now let's look at the oscillators. So the first oscillator I'm going to set to saw plus triangle, and like I've explained previously, the tuning I'm gonna use, it should be set to just C2, which is the default. But for this specific example, I'm gonna tune it to G2, so a fifth up. And the same for the second oscillator. I'll just do that as well. Alright, so I've set the shape for the first oscillator to saw plus triangle, and I'm gonna just play a little bit with the shape mod, which is basically pulse width modulation, so you get an idea of what that sounds like, because that's what we'll use in this patch as well. Alright, so for now we'll set it to 50%, which is halfway. And we will look at the second oscillator. The shape for this will be pulse. And you can use the oscillator mix to mix both oscillators, so I'll switch from only the first to hearing only the second. And I'll set this to 50% as well. Now let's combine the two sounds and set the oscillator mix to 64, which is 50%. So as you can hear, the sound of the oscillators combined is super stable. It's like there's no movement in there's no interplay between the oscillators. There's no movement in the sound, and that's because by default the the oscillators of the Prophet Rev2 are very stable. They're tuned very carefully. And they've introduced oscillator slop, which simulates this movement that you get with other analog synthesizers. So let's add a little of that oscillator slop. And I'll exaggerate a little so you know what it's doing. We'll set it to 20 in this case. Cool. The sub oscillator we're gonna leave switched off, which is the default, and we'll add some noise from the noise oscillator. Set that to 30, and finally we'll enable oscillator sync. You're not going to hear a lot of difference right now, but later on when I add other modulation and some other effects, it will have an impact on how fat the sound is sounding. Usually when you use oscillator sync, you have one oscillator tuned differently from the first one, but in this case we're going to leave them at the same tuning, and we'll come back to that later so that I can show you the difference. So next up is the filter. Right now we'll just leave it at the default settings, which is almost everything turned to 0. By the way, as you can see, I don't have my knob set to 0. If you want to know the value of a certain parameter, you can hold this parameters button, which says show above it, and when you then twist the knob, it will show you the value that it's currently at. So even though the knob is, I'm twisting the knob, but it's not changing the value, and this will help me to change a value when I want to, so that I'm not at the incorrect amount, I guess, right? So for the filter, it's going to be in 4-pole mode, and we're going to set the cutoff to about 100. Let's hear it. I'll increase it a little bit right now, but we'll use other ways to increase the high frequencies, even though the cutoff is still at a low position, but I'll show you that in a second. So the envelope for the filter, we're gonna cover that in the second part, but for now we'll just use some audio modulation for the filter. So what this does is it uses the incoming audio. It's of one of the oscillators, I don't remember exactly which one. This will modulate the filter at audio frequency. So let's listen to what that sounds like. Alright, so it adds some additional high frequencies, high harmonics to the sound. What's interesting is the interplay between the audio modulation and the noise oscillator. I'll let you hear that. So if you have audio modulation turned off and the noise set quite high, it sounds like this. But if you turn up audio modulation, that's what happens. I really like that sound. So finally, there's the amplifier section. We'll leave this set at the defaults as well, but right now there's just a few minor tweaks I want to do. The first is I want to set the attack to 5, just so we don't get p, but get v. So I'll show you. So we'll just use a little bit. And we'll set the release to 60. I'll just reset the values for noise and cutoff that I just made. Let's see. All right. And finally, for the amplifier, there's the most interesting aspect of this sound, or a very important aspect of this sound, I think. And unfortunately, I think it's quite unique to the Prophet Rev2. I don't see it on a lot of synthesizers, but I also haven't played a lot of synthesizers. So anyway, that's the pan spread. So you can spread the panning for the oscillators, for the separate voices actually. Spread them in the stereo field, and this happens randomly. Basically, the Prophet will determine which oscillator will go whether it will go more to the left or more to the right. And this is what it sounds like. Quite nice. We can leave it at full, but it depends on how you want to put it in the mix. I think for the jams that I recorded, I put it at about 75%, so that will be value 96. All right, so let's look at how we can make this sound more interesting. So we're going to move over to the LFO section now, and I will have oscillator 1 modulate the shape for the first oscillator, and LFO 2 modulate the shape of the second oscillator. So when you read shape mod, think pulse width modulation. And I want to have these two LFOs running at different speeds, and for that I'm gonna enable clock sync for both of them. And I'm gonna set the BPM to 120, which is the default. It's set up right in the top right corner. So to assign an LFO to a certain destination, you can do two things basically. First is to select the LFO and then scroll, use the destination knob to scroll to your desired destination. But a far easier way is to just hold the knob for the LFO and twist the knob that you want to modulate. So in this case, oscillator 1 shape. We're going to set the amount to 64, which is 50%. And we will set the frequency. As you can see, it's showing subdivisions and multiples of the BPM that we're using. So if you set it to 1 step, it would complete one oscillator, one LFO cycle for every step. But so in this case, for the first LFO, we're going to set it to, whoops, wrong button. We're going to set it to 2 steps, and the second oscillator is going to be set to 3 steps, so that they move at a different speed. I'll also assign the second LFO to the shape mod of oscillator 2, and the amount to 64 as well. Actually, I'm going to turn off the LFOs first, and so I can let you hear the difference. Let's start with LFO 1. And actually for this example, I'm gonna use the oscillator mix to only let you hear the sound for oscillator 1. And let's switch to oscillator 2. You can hear that it's moving at a different pace, and let's combine the two. Alright, so I still want to add a little more movement to this sound. So far we've only been modulating the pulse width, but I also want to modulate the pitch more. And for this I'm going to use the mod matrix. So I will use the select knob to scroll to the first mod slot. And you can use the assign source and assign destination buttons to assign the source and the destination of this modulation. The destination that I'm gonna use is the oscillator frequency for the second oscillator. So this controls pitch. This will modulate the pitch of the second oscillator, and the source is going to be the first LFO. And I'm just gonna use a very little amount. I think one will be fine, but I'll let you hear the difference. We could maybe even add a little more. I think this is too much already, so I'll just keep it at 1. Alright, and one additional thing that I thought would be interesting is to also modulate the slop a little. So I've explained this already, so let's use the second LFO to modulate the slop. So I'll go to mod slot 2, and we'll say the source for this modulation will be LFO2 and the destination will be slop. Let's see if we can hear the difference. Finally, the effect, distortion. This is gonna have a huge impact on the sound of this patch. Let's move over to the effect section and we'll scroll to the distortion effect. We'll turn it on. The first parameter for this effect will control the gain of the distortion, and the second one will control the tone of the distortion. I'll set the tone to full, and I'll set the gain to about 50%, and I'll introduce the effect by increasing the mix for the effect. Let's listen to it. Alright, so not a huge difference, but you can sort of hear a little bit of phasing going on when you have the mix set between the minimum value and the maximum value, which is actually why I prefer to set it to the maximum value, but I'll let you hear this again. So this is the sound I do not like, and I'll set it to max. There doesn't seem to be a huge difference in how the sound is affected by a distortion, so let's increase the distortion gain. Alright, so as you can hear, the volume increases as well, which is why I lowered it at the start. Let's find the sweet spot where we have distortion that sounds cool, but not too extreme. We can also play with the distortion tone a little bit to see what sounds best. I like to have, for this sound, I like to have the distortion tone at maximum, and that sounds good. Let's see if we can add some more ways to make this sound even more interesting and more effective. So one of the things that I like to do, and that I mentioned briefly at the start, is to add glide to this sound. So this only works for unison sounds, and this gives the overall sound a little more thump, I would say. Alright, cool, so let's enable this. Alright, that's a bit extreme. Let's see, I want to have the value set to 90. Actually, for some reason on the Rev2, it's not showing the value for the glide rate / time when I'm turning the knob. I don't know why. But again, I'm going to use show to show the value for this parameter. Alright, it's set at 87, but I want the value to be 90. So you can just use the value to set a very specific value. And without glide. Yeah, I like this. Alright, let's increase this effect even more by also adding pitch modulation when you're only pressing one note. So it will sort of simulate this glide effect, but just when you're pressing one note and not when you're switching between notes. And we're going to use the auxiliary envelope to accomplish this. So the destination that we'll use for the auxiliary envelope will be the frequency of all oscillators. And let's see if we can use the envelope so that I can show you what the effect will sound like. So. That's not what I want to accomplish, but a much milder version is what we're gonna go for. And let's see, we'll set the decay to around 32. And the amount to 24. And actually it would be cool if the amount of this effect that we hear is determined by the velocity as well, which means the harder I press the key, the stronger I will hear this effect. So let's try that. It's quite extreme, this pitch modulation, and I want to sort of make this vary a little as well over time, which means for one hit I want to hear more of this thump effect, and for another note I want to hear less. So let's use an LFO to modulate the amount that will be used for this pitch modulation. We're going to go to the mod matrix and select the third slot. The source will pick LFO2. Actually, sometimes, like it's doing now, even though I'm holding the assign source button and pressing the second LFO button, it will not automatically select the source. Same sometimes happens for destination. So right now I'm just going to use the value knob to select the source manually, LFO2. And the destination will be the envelope amount for envelope 3. And we're gonna set the amount to -24. So previously I set this to +24, and I'm setting the specific modulation for the LFO to -24. This could be plus as well, but I think this sounds cool. It's actually sounding quite extreme right now, and I'm gonna see if I can twist the knobs a little to find the values that I like more. Yeah, I think this sounds better. So I've reduced the envelope amount to 16, and all of the other settings are still the same. By the way, I'm including the values that I've used for this patch in the video description so that you know exactly which values to use. Let's look at the filter envelope finally. I think it's cool that we're having this thump, but it can sound a little too extreme if you don't have a little... I want to see if I can find a milder variation of it that still sounds thumpy. So let's set the envelope to -10, and the decay for the envelope to at 50%, so that would be 64. And I'll show you what I mean. This is an extreme variant, but I'm gonna use this in a subtle way. Sounds good. And finally, I like the filter to open up more when it reaches higher notes that are higher in the registry. So this one should open the filter up more than this one. We'll use key amount for the filter to do that. And we need to compensate a little by reducing the cutoff. I'll make it extreme so you hear what this does. So we'll just use a little of that. I'm using, let's say 20. Cool. The last part I'm gonna do is add a little accent. I've mentioned this at the start of the video. When I'm using Aftertouch, I want the sound to get a little bit more extreme, a little bit more hectic. And for this, I'm going to modulate the filter when I hold it down harder. So when I use Aftertouch on the keys. So first, let's assign the third LFO to the filter cutoff, and we'll use a triangle shape. By the way, I didn't mention this before, but I've used triangle shape for the first two LFOs as well. So this third LFO will not be clock synced, and the frequency will set to around 75. Let's check the amount to see whether it's doing what we want it to do. Yeah, that sounds good. I'm going to set the amount to 0 right now because we only want to hear this when we use Aftertouch. So to accomplish this, we'll go to Mod Matrix again and use the select button to scroll all the way to the end, almost at the end. And there's a separate slot for pressure or Aftertouch. So the destination will be LFO3 amount, and the amount of modulation will apply to this LFO amount. Let's try a little. So I'm gonna use Aftertouch now and hold it so we can try to find the sweet spot. Yeah, I think this is nice, so I'll let you hear what this does. That sounds cool, but what if we could also have the LFO be less steady and have its frequency change a little, so that you would get not but something like this, right? So what we're gonna do is use another mod slot in the modulation matrix. So mod slot 4, the source for this will be the first LFO, and the destination will be the frequency of the third LFO. And let's use amounts to figure out what is an interesting movement for this modulation. I think that sounds pretty cool. By the way, one thing to mention if you have the clock sync enabled for an LFO, you cannot do the trick that I just did, meaning let's say we have LFO1 is modulating the filter. If you want to have LFO2 modulate the frequency of LFO1, that's only possible if clock sync is disabled for LFO1. Unfortunately, I would actually have hoped that this would be possible. It would be interesting to switch between multiples and subdivisions of your BPM, but it's not possible as far as I know. If you do know that it's possible, please tell me, because it would be cool. So this sounds pretty neat. But I'm gonna make it a little more interesting even by just adding another mod slot, so that I can have the aftertouch, so pressure, also impact the frequency of the third LFO. Meaning if I press it harder, it will go faster. So let's set the mod source, and now I'm using these knobs here, using the parameter knob to go to the source parameter, and then scroll all the way to pressure. And the destination again will be the frequency of the third oscillator. So the third oscillator is selected, which is why I'm able to directly grab the frequency. And I'm gonna set the, let's try again with the amount. Alright, so the amount I've used is 10. It shouldn't be too extreme, otherwise the effect will be less audible and it will be too hectic, is my opinion. One thing that I think is worth noting is that the noise oscillator can actually add a lot of character to the specific sound. Let's listen to it. So why don't we also increase the noise level a little bit when you use aftertouch? So we'll select mod slot 6. For the source, we'll go to pressure again. For the destination, we'll select noise, and let's see what works well. Alright, so that's the final ingredients to completing this patch. I'm going to enable the reverb once more so you can hear what that sounds like. And I'm also using hold to sustain the notes so that it's easier for me to play the sequence that I did. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope this was useful. Please leave any questions or suggestions you may have in the comments, and have fun playing this dirty bass patch. Okay, bye.